Speaker, who is from Florida Citizens for Science, which is a diverse group of concerned parents, educators, employers, and just about everything else under the Florida sun, united to defend and promote real science, especially in the public school classroom. Its current focus is on defending our state science standards, which have only recently been established again, and helping to implement them across Florida. They also take an active role in rooting out attempts to replace biology, astronomy, and other basic scientific studies with usually religious-based quackery. The blatant promotion of anti-scientific ideas frequently involves intelligent design and creationism as the usual suspect. Such distracting fights can be very costly once anti-science establishes a toehold in a given area. Headlines in Kansas, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Ohio over the past couple of decades attest to this. Florida citizens concerned with the urgent need for scientific understanding in this challenging environment must be vigilant and take action before narrow ideologies get traction in Florida. Dr. Jonathan Smith, our guest today, is a consultant specializing in the teaching of scientific concepts and addressing misconceptions within those concepts. He holds a BSc, MSc degree from Wellingborough Technical College in the UK and received his PhD from the University of Phoenix in Scientific Pedagogy and Instructive Strategies. He is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Council for Scientific Education and serves as Vice President for Florida Citizens. I am pleased and honored to present Dr. Jonathan Smith.
Is the microphone on, or can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly.
You can hear me perfectly? Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me today on this hot and sticky Florida afternoon, but I really appreciate your coming, giving me your time. Actually, I'm quite a local boy. I live in Lithia. I hope maybe some of you have heard of that. That's out in, east of Brandon. I have a little farm out there and spend a lot of my time either out that area or doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But I don't know many of you in this room. I have had some communication with the atheist organizations, usually through the Freedom from Religion Foundation and a few other organizations. I do give talks at the United Unitarian Church and a few other places. But it's great to be here, and thanks so much again for inviting me. We're going to talk about, well, I might get round to it sometime during the hour, if science and religion are compatible. And I don't know whether we'll get that far today or not. But anyway, I'm not going to present either side biasly, but I think it might become quite obvious when I start talking which way that I obviously favour. Obviously, I'm not from Alabama. That would probably be a giveaway. I'm from Great Britain, and I just wondered if any of you had ever been to the British Isles and visited. Okay. You did? Let me see if my next slide will work from home. Wrong slide. Okay. This is completely the wrong slide. So I think what I'm going to have to try and do is just to wing it by ear all the way through without any slides. I'm sorry. What has happened for some reason, my computer is starting on one slideshow and going to an absolutely different slideshow. So I'm going to just try and wing it. So I'm sorry about that, but that's just the way it goes sometimes. Okay. Like I said, I'm from Great Britain, and one of the most famous and well-known places in Great Britain is Loch Ness. Any of you been or know what about Loch? What's Loch Ness famous for?
The monster.
Right. Okay, that's right. That's right. Well, okay. I realise we have a room for the skeptic. Let me ask you a quick question. Those people who believe the Loch Ness monster exists, or could believe it could possibly exist, could you raise your hands?
Possibly.
2, 3. This is obviously a room of skeptics. I can tell that right off the bat. Okay, so raise your hands, I guess, the rest of you who think they believe that the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, or they believe it probably doesn't exist. Okay. All right. Those of you who raised your hands and said that they believe it existed, let me see you again. Okay.
I said probably.
Okay, leave your hands up and tell me. Let's leave you raise your hands, but if you can tell me, or keep your hands raised, I should say, if you could show me one piece of empirical evidence, scientific evidence that would support your belief. Okay? That's what I figured. Those of you who don't believe in the Loch Ness Monster, I'm sorry, did you have a piece of empirical evidence?
I would just say a fossil.
Okay, yeah, but we haven't found one yet.
That is not
Yeah,
necessarily suggest
but you
that
believe in it,
today.
but you've there's no fossils. Okay, but there is no fossils, so you're wrong. Okay. Okay, those who don't believe in the monster, okay, I want them to raise their hands. I want to know one piece of scientific empirical evidence you could use to support your belief.
Closest thing I've seen yet was an article about waves. A series of waves looks just like that, or you could be interpreted
Right.
to be that.
Right. Well, sorry, you
That's
sort of that's very good. That's a good point. But as you notice, we all had an opinion, right? But most of it, 90% of it, wasn't based on any kind of evidence. And this is the difference between a belief structure and science. Science works completely different from a belief structure.
The evidence is very compelling. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, go ahead.
The evidence is that there aren't any giant underwater lizards anywhere else on this planet.
Right.
That's very compelling.
Right, but that's a good point. But we have a couple of people either way that have some fairly relevant issues. I don't want to get onto questions and answer things. We'll probably do that at the end. But so I need to move on a little bit. But the point I was trying to make, obviously, is that religion and science, or belief in something and science, are not necessarily correlated. So, and most of the contradiction that I seem to have when I try to teach science or have an issue about science is purely from a religious point of view, from a religious perspective. No one ever comes to me and complains about what we teach in science based on any other perspective except for religion. So I guess what I'm asking today is, are science and religion compatible? What we probably need to do is look on a broader aspect and to see if we think they really are. Excuse me, it's really hot in here. I usually get criticism from people who are religious when we discuss science. And please don't think I'm putting myself on the same level as Christopher Hitchens or Daniel Dennett or Richard Dawkins or any of those greats, but I've noticed in probably the last year and a half that I have been able to receive criticism not just from religious people but also from non-religious people about this. And I call them religious accommodationists, who seem to think that religion's a good thing, and it may well be on certain issues, but it needs some sort of pass, that science is not allowed to criticize anyone's religious beliefs. Their position is usually, and I have to say this, a somewhat arrogant one, because they tend to say, well, you know, religion's for the masses, you know, they need it, it gives them comfort, somebody dies, you know, and it makes them feel good. But I don't need that. You know, I don't need that religion. But if it does somebody good, what would you be sort of like you're no better than a fundamental Christian. You're more of a fundamental atheist or a fundamental scientist. You know, I go to and give lectures, and I usually have someone come up to me and they say, I enjoyed your talk, however, and I'm an atheist, however, or but. And as soon as I hear the but word, I know what's coming next, and it's going to be a criticism of science. Now, my point is, for the last 1,000 years or better, religion has not only criticized science, but it's held science in sway. I mean, you couldn't practice science without approval from certain religions, whether you lived in the East or the West. Obviously, in the East it was Islam, in the West it was basically Christianity. And if you said something that was disagreeable about religion, if you had a scientific fact or scientific theory or something that was a set of processes that you were going through, and you wanted that to be known or published, you had to get permission from the church. And let me tell you something. Well, you had two choices. You either got permission or you didn't publish it. Now, of course, if it was something that in some way backed up religion, then of course they would be very happy to accept it. But if it didn't, and you went ahead and published your work, but 400 or 500 years ago, you could go to jail to be under house arrest like Da Vinci, or you could face burning at the stake. Now, the tables have turned somewhat in the last 200 years, especially since Charles Darwin. And I'm not advocating in putting people in jail or religious people in jail, but I mean, they are open to criticism just like anything else. I mean, we criticize movies, we criticize music, we criticize most things, but we seem to have a pass, or not given a pass, when it comes to criticizing religion. And I think that's not a good thing. So usually when I give a speech like this, I would say there's a good reason that I'm probably going to say something. If you're religious or religious by nature, I don't feel I have to do that today, but I'm probably going to say something that seems detrimental or at least confrontational about people's religious beliefs. But unfortunately, that's what science does. You know, science is impartial. It is like non-religious. But at least it is when you do science. Science is not a democracy. It's not whoever, is the most popular. It's based on facts. It's based on empirical evidence. And in the last 200 years, science has slowly gained on people's religious beliefs. And since Darwin, of course, he was the obvious one, showed that we don't need a divine creator. We don't need someone to guide us through our lives. Basically, our whole life, our whole structure could be through the process of evolution, which negates a need for a creator. And of course, that didn't go down very well in a community, whose thoughts that humans was, specially created. We live in an anthropocentric universe, which everything in the universe was created entirely for us, which of course we know that it wasn't now. But I mean, that's a great conflict. So you probably could see where I'm going with this, the difference between science and a religious conviction. Now, having said that, and that I do get criticism from people who are accommodationists, the usual criticism I got was from people who, I think we just talked about a little bit, in the creationist or intelligent design movement, who try to fabricate, as Richard Dawkins once said, ID is nothing but creationism in a tuxedo. I understand that. And basically it's a way of indoctrinating religion into the science classroom. So that's something, as a member of the Florida Citizens for Science, that we look against. Because you may think it's not terribly important that science and religion can be compatible, but it is important to some and not to others. Now, we're not asking for science to be compatible with religion in certain areas, because, we're told that there are two different ways of looking at the world, but do you think that's really true? Would you say that science and religion are separate issues, are separate ways of looking at the truth of things? I don't think it is. That was sort of a question. I don't think it is. Because let me ask you this. There are certain questions that religion asks, and I'm going to look at a couple of those today. And I personally think there's certain questions that science asks, which are the same questions. And those questions are about, I can't say what they all are. I only want to speak about a couple today. But I mean, things about the origin of life, things about our purpose in life, things about, what am I looking for, the word I'm looking for, miracles. I mean, miracles defy science. So I want to look at a few of those and see if, the religious side of it and the science side of it. It's really hard going, I'm sorry, I'm trying to talk without my prompts, and it's very, very, very difficult right now. There was a famous scientist called Stephen Jay Gould who came up with a concept. It was called NOMA. Are any of you familiar with the term NOMA, N-O-M-A, non-overlapping magistera. He was a scientist, a very, very world-famous biologist, but he didn't want to really deal with the religious issue. So he came up with this idea that there was no overlapping, science is in this area and religion is in that area. And he also used an example, the fact that many scientists also hold religious beliefs, which is absolutely true. And some of those scientists, and some of them I've met personally, use their religious beliefs to promote their scientific worldview. There's a very famous one. Actually, he's the head of the science department for the White House, actually. And he's decided that he wanted to become a born-again Christian. And so he went out to search. His name's Collins, by the way. And he went out to search for his religious convictions. So he goes out in the Cascade Mountains. And he goes around this corner and comes out into a field, and there's 3 waterfalls that are frozen. This is in the winter. And he writes in his book that he fell on his knees because he saw the Trinity, and that is what he could believe in, and that what turned him to being a Christian. Now, this is a gentleman that is the head of the Human Genome Project. So he demands every single piece of scientific evidence to back his findings. He uses all the scientific precepts, and yet in a other part of his mind, and I call it, for lack of a better word, compartmentalizing. He's able to demand, ultimate proof for his science, and yet he comes to a position where he sees something like that and immediately feels that it's a sign from the divine. And I'm not sure how, as a scientist, and he's a good one, can do that. There's another scientist, and I can't remember his name now because I don't have my prompt, but I know the name of his book. He might remember his book. It's called Finding Darwin's God. Any of you familiar with that book? He tries to coordinate he's a practicing Catholic. Now, he obviously accepts the fact that he teaches evolutionary biology in a classroom. He's a science professor who's written many, many books. And yet, he actually believes that when he goes to church on a Sunday and partakes of the Eucharist, that the actual wafer and blood actually are transformed into the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Now, how you can do that is beyond me. How you can demand absolute, certain proof of one thing and yet almost demand no proof of another. In actual fact, I kind of stepped away a little bit. I had to bring this a little bit more into the highlight of things between science and religion. I had a joke about Loch Ness, and I forgot it, but I'm going to have to tell you this little joke. There's an American couple. They in the little village of Loch Ness, and they're in a little town, and they go into the store. And the store is absolutely full of memorabilia of the Loch Ness Monster. It has books and pens and pads and notebooks and everything else. And, his wife's walking around and she's picking things up and putting them down, as women normally do. And her husband's walking behind her like this, bored out of his mind, like men usually do. And eventually this shop owner goes over to him and says, is there anything I can help you with? And the lady says, no, I'm fine. But the American tourist says to the shop owner, you are the shop owner, right? And he said, yeah. He said, I have to ask you a question. He said, I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude. He said, but, all this memorabilia. And he said, you make a living from this. You see all this memorabilia, but you don't have the slightest bit of evidence that the Loch Ness Monster exists. So the shop owner says, well, let me ask you a question. What do you do for a living? He said, well, actually, I'm from Atlanta, and I'm a Baptist preacher. So he said, well, you should understand the concept perfectly. But however, I didn't want to leave that out because I thought it was quite interesting. But so we have this dichotomy between science and religion. So let's look at a couple of things and ask yourself, really, even if science and religion, I think I'm leading you down the road, hopefully. And I'm not trying to make you change your mind one way or the other, but I think I'm leading you down to the road to say my personal opinion is that science and religion are certainly not compatible. They're not. Because, again, as I mentioned, they ask certain questions of the world. And I want to look at those questions in a little bit. But the thing is, if they are or not compatible, what does it matter? How does it affect us? Just as regular citizens. I mean, if science and religion are not compatible, how does it affect us? What it affects us, I think, obviously, politically, because we know that certain parties tend to be more Christian than others, and they tend to propagate their ideas into their political viewpoints. And I'm not a biologist, but I mean, let's look at, for instance, the issue of, say, stem cell research. The only objection against stem cell research is what? Is a what one? It's a religious one. There's no other objection to stem cell research other than a religious objection. And they weigh up this balance, and I don't know whether you've ever thought deeply about it, maybe I think too much, but we look at a stem cell which has probably around 500 cells in it, and to give you an idea how much embryonic, it's called a blastocyst. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the term. It's called a blastocyst. There's about 500 cells, and when you consider there's like 500,000 cells in the brain of a fly, you get some idea of how small it is. Yet somehow this small blastocyst outsets or outweighs, we could say, the well-being of an 8-year-old girl who's probably has, say, for instance, 80% burns. And she needs to be cured. And, developing stem cells could actually help with the development of curing people, or at least healing people. But of course, it's a religious point of view, because they believe once that blastocyst takes effect, once it's a potential for a human being, then it must have a soul. And if it has a soul, I mean, these are the arguments. They really are. If it has a soul, then if you destroy that, then you're destroying a soul. The only thing that I have a problem with as a scientist is the fact that at one point a blastocyst can split into two groups, and it's called a chimera. So now, if the soul is inserted initially and now it's split, does the soul split, or does it go just to one and not into the other? And the only downside of that is that sometimes when they split, after a short period of time, they're drawn back together again. So where does the spare soul go? But it all gets ludicrous. It obviously does. So, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But this is the kind of objection we have to science. Now let's look at another level. And this is something that I've been very much involved in the last 20 years. And this is the teaching of non-science, creationism, into a science classroom. There is no way that any creation myth belongs in a science classroom. It is not science. It has not the preponderance of science. There's not a shred of evidence. And they're not even genuine in the way they try to propagate those ideas into a science classroom. I mean, I'm sure most of you know how science proceeds. You come up with an idea, you look for the evidence, you test that evidence. If evidence is good, you look for more evidence. If evidence is bad, or you find evidence that disproves it, if it's falsifiable, then you start from the beginning. But you go through a process until you come up with a set of facts, and it becomes a theory. That theory then is accepted in science. It is peer-reviewed. It goes through papers for 15, 20 years, and finally it makes its way into the science classroom. Now, the creationist idea is this. We don't do that. We don't follow any of those presuppositions of science. We go completely over the top of science, over the top of empirical evidence, and through political means, which is having candidates on school boards that you vote in, or you give money to, you fund, to get these individual candidates into the school board, and that way you can get your, quote, intelligent design, which is just another name for creationism, indoctrinated or put in to the science classroom. It's a very disingenuous way to do it. I mean, and this is what we do, and it's being done in a lot of states. Sometimes, unfortunately, I have to say this quite successfully. Places like Texas have managed to at least sneak creationism into a certain point, or what they'll do is they'll have a disclaimer in the science textbook saying evolution is just a theory. Any of you really can give me the definition of a theory scientifically?
You need to go through the whole process of hypothesis testing and analysis of the results. And the theory is the result that has not been disproven.
Right. How many times we hear it's just a theory? The common understanding of a theory is a hunch or a guess. But in scientific terms, a theory is exactly what you said. It's based on a set of empirical scientific evidence. And yet, places like Alabama have a school book, science books, that says there's a disclaimer that evolution is just the theory. So it is important. It is important. If we want our children to have a great science education, if we want our children to be competitive in a world that's going above us, I mean, if you look at the level of science education in Florida, for instance, compared with the rest of the United States, we in the bottom third, at least. But if you take the top standard of education in the United States, which is possibly California or Massachusetts or I think Idaho, believe it or not, their education level is about 25th in the world. So places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Great Britain all have higher levels of science education. Guess who's getting all the STEM jobs, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? It's not coming to Florida. It's going to better states. And it's not coming to the United States because businesses don't want to take their businesses to countries like the United States where they don't have a good workforce, an informed workforce. A friend of mine that works for NASA actually gave me a little analogy. I was talking about there's a prospect that we might be sending a rocket ship to Mars sometimes. You know, we've sent quite a few probes. And I said, what do you see? And he said, let me tell you what I see. He said, I see one day in the future at the Kennedy Space Center, and I see a rocket ship made in China or Hong Kong with technology developed in India with scientists on board from Russia. He said, and when that rocket ship takes off, there'll be a bunch of American kids in a marching band and cheerleaders. And as the thing goes up, and they'll be our band and they'll be our cheerleaders, and the cheerleaders' parents will look and say, my kids are on TV, aren't they great? I mean, it sounds funny, but it's not. This is where we're headed. And this is the kind of obstructions we come in the science community. This is why it's important. And I have to say this, and again, it's not to be offensive to any religious beliefs, but this is the one and sole objection when we teach science is from a religious perspective. And my job, if you want to say that, is to promote good science and be involved in good science education. Now, just recently, we've had the NGSS, which is the next generation of science standards. And basically, the NGSS is a national standard. It is made up from scientists from different groups of scientists, different organizations. The AAAS is one of them. And they've released the standards about 2 or 3 months ago. And these standards were cost-free to the states. They were far superior to Florida's. Do you think Florida has adopted those or even thought about adopting them? At the outset of those standards, we were offered a position that we could have been a partner in the development of those standards. We turned it down. Now the standards are out, we're still turning them down. And now we're thinking about fixing the standards that we had 4 or 5 years ago. Now, the reason why, and I believe this is a fact, that we're turning these standards down is, guess what they contain? Evolution, stem cell research, climate change. These are all religious convictions, religious obstructions. And the problem is, and I can fully understand the boards of education of different states not wanting to adopt these standards. And when you look at it, it's a good idea because you have a set of standards in Florida, then you have a set of standards in Alabama and Kentucky and Maine and Georgia. They're all different, completely different. If you're an 8th grader in Florida and you move to California or Alabama or Kentucky or whatever it is, you're going to learn something completely different. So you have no way as a teacher or as a state of comparing the level of your science or how well your teachers are teaching or how well your students are learning until you compare them with something else. But we have no way to compare them with anywhere else. So the point I'm making is if we adopted a national set of standards, then we would know that. But the main objection is coming from religious organizations. And whenever you hear the word family in any organization, you know where you're going to go with that. It's always the Association from American Families. You know it's a religious organization, and you know full well that there's going to be an objection to science. And it just, as a scientist, it really, it's very discouraging. I've actually been out in Arizona serving on a committee to adopt the new NGS standards, the national standards. And the objection in Arizona is just the same as we're getting in Florida. And you realize how difficult it is to give your kids a good set of science standards when you have these completely religious objections. It's not that there's an alternative. There's not that there's anything else. And there's a theme behind it. Many years ago, a retired scientist come attorney called Philip Johnson divided a set of ideals called the wedge strategy. And it's online if you want to go look at it, the wedge strategy. And basically his ideology was, because he thought that, science was definitely secular, it was leading towards atheism. He wanted to get rid of it. So he designed this strategy called the wedge document, basically to support people who are religious, to get them in on the school boards, to turn us back basically to a theocracy. And that was their main goal. And fortunately, it's failing. I don't know whether any of you were involved in this a few years ago. There was a very famous trial that took part, I think, in 2005 or 2006. It was called Tammy Kitzmiller versus the Dover School Board. I don't know if you're familiar with that. The presiding judge of the trial was a judge called John Jones. He was a Christian, Republican judge, appointed by George Bush, no other than. And he overseed the trial. And basically what it was, the Dover School Board wanted to have creationism taught in the school classroom. And a well-known atheist, Tammy Kitzmiller, decided that she was going to fight it. And she took them to court. And the judge looked at the evidence, and with that, people testifying for both sides. And you ought to read the transcript of the judge of the trial. He called it a breathtaking inanity that those people on the school board would profess their religious convictions and yet lie profusely about where they got the money to buy the creationist textbooks. There is a organization in this country that we're fighting against to demonize science, to bring science down and replace some sort of theocracy. I mean, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it really isn't. I mean, you can look and you can see. So that's what basically my position as a member of the Florida Citizens for Science is to fight against. Now, we do have some members in our organization that are, religious. Some are not. Some are atheists. It's pretty obvious my side of the camp. But we all work towards a common goal, which is to put good science education in the science classroom. And when you other things we look at, not just evolution, for instance, look at the age of the Earth. 6,000 years old is what most Christian people believe, or most creationists believe. The Earth is only 6,000 years old. I think Richard Dawkins says it's not a trivial error, because of the age of the Earth itself is around 4.5 billion years. And I think Richard Dawkins said it was like accepting the fact the distance from New York to San Francisco was 7 yards. That's the margin of error that we have. That's one thing. How the universe was formed, the age of the universe, which is 3.5 billion years old. Again, they think that everything was formed in its present system, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. It's certainly not very conducive to good science education. You can also look at the other unscientific things. I mean, and this is purely nothing to do with education, but you could look at, as I talked about earlier, miracles. I mean, you may say, what does it matter? It's just a miracle. But what does a miracle do? It suspends science. I mean, if you think that a virgin birth happened, then it obviously suspends science. If you think the sun can stop moving in the sky for 24 hours, so the Midianites could win a battle, that's a scientific conflict. So, I mean, there is a great dispute between religion and science. And as I said before, my aim and my goal or my endeavor is to keep the two separate. I'm not against or opposed to people having their religious convictions, that they're perfectly welcome to that. But unfortunately, they can't keep them to themselves. It has to infringe on science, and I'm not. I mean, if I go and teach evolution in a school classroom, I don't tell them kids they have to believe in it. They have to know it, they have to be tested on it, and they have to understand it. But whether they accept it or not, that's up to them. It's their decision. I don't try to force science on anyone, but the shoe's not on the other foot, because I get religion forced on science every minute of the day, and that's what I do. To wrap up, I'm sorry that my talk seemed perhaps a little disjointed. I don't have my prompt. I'm sure there's a few things I've missed, but I think rather than keep rambling on, I'm pretty sure you might have a few questions, or a few comments. So far away. Just let me get a quick drink. Yes, ma'am.
How are the other countries that you mentioned, that are so far ahead of us in science? How did they keep religion out of their science and be able to move forward? I know
Well-
Denmark and those places, religion's not a big issue, but maybe in England.
Well, you have to remember something. No, I mean, Denmark and Sweden, Norway, they're basically secular countries. I think if you took a poll of their country, I think only about 25 or 30% are religious. Now, in England, it's a little more than that, and it seems like a very funny dichotomy to me, because in England, the head of the country and the church is who? Queen. So she's not only head of politics, she's head of the church. Now in America, supposedly, which is a joke in my opinion, we're supposed to have a separation of church and state, which doesn't always work, but it's a wonderful idea. Now England, church and state are inexorably tied together. However, we don't have that issue in schools about science and religion. We maybe it's because we're structured different, because we're a smaller country and we're not so overtly religious. I mean, 25 or 30% of people in England are practicing Christians, but it's more of a social thing. I mean, my biggest shock when I came over here was how overtly religious it was in America. I mean, I didn't even... My mother used to have a saying. She said the only time we went to church is when someone was either hatched, matched, or dispatched. And that's the only time we ever went to church. I really didn't think about church. Maybe Christmas Eve, I'd go there for midnight mass and sing the carols happily. But they really didn't have any meaning. So I think there's a way that you certainly can separate science and religion pretty easily and be able to teach kids science. Now, there's another thing, and this may be something you all wouldn't agree with, but I don't think it's an issue in England. We were taught a subject in England called religious knowledge. You were taught science and math and English and geography and history, but we also had a class which was mandatory all the way through school called religious knowledge. Now, it wasn't to propagate any particular religious ideology, but we examined all the religions in the world, all the Abrahamic religions, even, the older religions like, the Greek gods and the Roman gods. So he gave us a perspective all about religion. So we understood it from every aspect. So it wasn't necessary for us to go somewhere and go to a church or something and get our religious knowledge. And I think maybe that's something we're lacking in this country. I mean, kids are able to be taught in school, but maybe if we had a class on it and they could see the folly, perhaps, of and not so much being indoctrinated, then, we become a less religious country, more secular. Though I absolutely feel that maybe you agree with me that we're slightly heading that way. The polls are getting a little better. Unfortunately, when you do a poll about, and you word it, what do you believe in as far as evolution is concerned, 60% of people in this world don't believe in this country rather, don't believe in evolution. They consider that the Earth was created, as we said, 6,000 years ago. Evolution is not true. 35% of all science teachers that teach science in Florida believe that also. So your kids are going to a school where a science teacher is teaching evolution, but how well they're going to teach it when they really don't believe in it. So it is an issue. But, whether that'll change, if we have the next generation of science standards that we're working towards, I think that could certainly change, because it will leave out the voting side of it. I mean, if we make standards for Florida, those standards have to be presented by the State Board of Education, and this Board of Education have to approve those standards. And they have a lot of political pressure on them not to approve them. But if we adopt the next generation science standards, there's no discussion. It's over and done with. So hopefully we're working towards that, and we're trying. That's all I can say. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Yes, I think it would be beneficial if you would challenge your audiences at any given time to compose a list of the benefits to the human race, practical, objective benefits to the human race that have been provided by religion, as opposed to those that have been provided by science, starting with penicillin.
Well, that would be a wasted question, because there are no practical benefits that the religion has ever brought. I always thought, when I don't know if you experienced this, but you've heard of the term "God of the gaps," correct? Where science, has just got a gap, and they say, well, where did thunder come from? It's Thor and his hammer. Science gradually moves on, pushes poor old Thor out of his gap, and then Thor, in the end, ends up on the scrap heap of mythology. Now we've come to a point we can answer most questions. And the religious philosophers have come to an issue where God of the gaps maybe is not a good idea. They've finally caught on to that, because as soon as science fills that gap, where does their God go? And, it's gone from this planet to, now I get what comes before the Big Bang. How can something come? We've gone all the way from, evolution through the end of the universe. So when we finally come up with, what happened prior to the Big Bang, then where does their God go then? I really don't know. What I do get, though, and from a lot of religious philosophers, and I have studied it marginally, is that, we're not going to take the God of the gaps route. You criticizing religion, you really don't understand the nuances. Look at the Bible. Now, of course, we don't believe that the account of creation in Genesis is absolutely true. It's just allegorical. We know Noah's flood. And these are people who are religious. We know Noah's flood's not true. It's just, a parable about, people live in the desert and they follow God's will, and, they get rewarded for it. We know all that's not true. The thing is, you scientists, are not theologians. You don't understand the nuances. And my answer to them would be, well, who makes the decision what is allegorical and what is not allegorical? You just said that the creation of the universe is in Genesis is not to be taken literally. Well, then, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and he was born of a virgin? Oh, yeah, that's true. They have that answer immediately that it's true. So who decides? And let me ask you, who decides whose opinion is the most valid? I mean, when you look at a certain text is in any book, whether it's the Quran or the Bible, who makes that decision, the validity of that text? Who decides whether it's allegorical or not, or it's to be taken literally or not? And who's to say that person's opinion is any better than mine, yours, or the pizza delivery boy? It isn't. But that's the game of semantics they play. I'm told now that I just don't understand the nuances of religion. I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said, "What's the definition of a religious philosophy?" And I said, "I don't know." He said, "Chloroform in print." Yes, sir.
Yes, let me congratulate you on giving a very full exposition of the question. Thank you. Also, we here in Hillsborough County, Florida, at this time have, I think, some real challenges in getting a renewed emphasis on good science being taught in our schools. Do you know of any particular cases that are being argued right now around this question? And another point I wanted to make was, how can those of us who have an interest in secular and scientific education help in this matter?
That's a great question. Actually, we have a really great... Hillsborough is one of the best counties in the state, believe it or not, to have a really good... You may not agree with me as far as their science department is concerned. You have the head of the science department, a gentleman I'm familiar with called Larry Plank. I don't know whether any of you have heard of him. He's very pro-science. There have been some elections I've noticed and shuddered because there's one or two creationists that have tried to get on the local Hillsborough County School Board. But if you'd have asked me that question a few months ago, when the next generation of science standards were about to be released, there was a comment section. And if you had gone into the comment section, you could have made a comment whether you... It basically went through what the standards were, and you could make a comment if you agreed with them, what you thought about them, if you liked them or not. And that comment was being considered not just by the local Board of Education in Hillsborough County, but it was being considered by the State Board of Education. So anytime you're looking at something like that, look at the Florida, I hate to plug, but look at the Florida Citizens for Science website, because we stay up with that on a daily basis. And we'll tell you where to go. We'll point you what websites you can view to support science. Also, the Florida Aquarium have a great staff there. They're very pro-science. They do classes for kids. That's something, if you felt you could get involved in. We're in good standing in this county. Now, if you go down to Manatee County or Hardy County, they've got lots of problems. But Hillsborough, I think the more rural that you get, I hate to say this, the more difficult it is to get good science education and good science standards. I'm sorry? From out of Lithia Springs, on knowledge.
Well, hi, my name's Catherine.
Hey, Catherine.
I've relocated here a little less than 2 years ago from Dade County, from Miami.
Right.
And typically I tend to agree with the idea that the more rural, the less likely to be scientifically or a more religious perspective. I actually attended a school board meeting in Broward County that they were having. This was about, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago. And I was really surprised that in the middle of Broward County, which is a pretty much as a city environment, people were getting up and saying, "Why, look around you. Don't you see God right there? He's in front of you." I mean, it was a discussion of teaching evolution. Of course, I was there, obvious from which perspective I was there. But it was mind-boggling that so many people, a guy who was an engineer, and I thought he was going to profess science, all of a sudden he turns around and says that there's absolute proof that God is present. And I'm sitting here with my jaw on the ground. You know, that this is what needs to be taught in our science classrooms.
Well, fortunately, it's illegal right now. It can't be taught in the science classes, and if we find anyone, we try to stay vigilant. If we find anyone, a teacher actually putting creationism into a science classroom, I don't think they'll risk it, because it is a risky business. When the Dover school board tried to do that, in the trial I talked about earlier, it was the judge fined them $1 million, and 8 weeks later. Yeah, 8 weeks later, there was an election, and every one of the school board members were voted off the school board. But I mean, it's with evolution, and this is really my subject. It always gives the appearance of design. I mean, you can say that something looks designed because it gives the appearance. It doesn't mean it is. I mean, if you looked at a snowflake under a microscope, it gives the appearance of a design, but we obviously know that it isn't. So people see, I think as humans, we're hardwired to see design in everything. We had to be that way. We had, if we saw some grass rustling somewhere and we looked and, is that a saber-toothed tiger, or is it just the grass rustling? Well, what was the best thing to do? Well, it's just the grass rustling. It's somebody's dinner, okay? The best thing to do was to get out of there, whether you were right or wrong. And I think that predisposition comes through our evolutionary processes, and I think it's with us today. Honestly, I believe that religion is an offset in some way or other of our evolutionary processes, just like altruism, helping someone you don't know. I think it's something that we, that came through our evolutionary process and still stays with us. But the good thing we have to know is that, science cannot be removed from the science classroom, and if religious beliefs are taught, sooner or later someone's going to say something, someone's going to find out, and it's going to be taken care of. That's just the way it is, and we're lucky that's happening.
I want to change the subject just a little bit.
Okay.
Do you have any comments on the theories of ancient alien visitation?
It's funny, took a few. Let me just try to back up here. A few months ago, I finished a course at the University of Edinburgh. I'm talking about Scotland. It was an online course in astrobiology. It was, in fact, if any of you haven't been on Coursera, you can take some really good courses online. Did you do it? Oh, so I thought you were. Did you do it? Okay. But anyway, it was a 12-week course. It was a fairly high level, but I mean, it was very interesting. I'm sure a lot of you could have taken the course. And that was, so a few weeks ago, I was at the United Unitarian Church in Lakeland giving a talk, and somebody asked me the same question. I'll just give you an answer. My daughter is a professor of astrophysics at the University of Arizona. She's also the head scientist at the Multiple Mirror Telescope, which is on Mount Lemmon in Arizona. So that's all she does for a living. She originally worked on the Spitzer Space Telescope, which is an infrared telescope that actually is in space. She worked on that for 4 years, and now she works on the ground telescope. I've asked her the same question. And this is what her reply was, basically. She said, look, Dad, she said, all I do, the majority of my life, is look through a telescope at space. I've never seen a UFO or an alien. All my colleagues, that's all they do. In every country throughout the world, they're astrophysicists, they're astronomers. They see UFOs. What does UFO mean? You unidentified flying object. First of all, we don't know whether it's flying. It may not be flying. It's unidentified, so how do you know it's a flying? If it's unidentified, you don't know what it is anyway. And she said, just imagine this. Do you really think it's practical for a species that are so advanced that can maybe go through wormholes and whatever, so they get in their rocket ship or whatever you want to call it, and they come trillions of miles through space, missing black holes, planets, suns, comets, meteorites, and they hit a telephone pole in Roswell? It doesn't make any sense. So I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that we were visited by aliens. Now, are they aliens on other planets? I would say that the preponderance of evidence must be that I would think it's quite likely that they are. In doing this course, this class that I just did on astrobiology, what we look for is what is known as Goldilocks planets. You've heard of that term? Goldilocks planets, not too hot, not too cold. They're found and continue to find And there's a way you can do it. It's called gravitational phasing. You can look at a planet, figure the size of it and see if it would possibly, could have the elements in it that could contain life. I mean, it may not, it may. The only way we can look at it is through what we know, such as carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. If the planet contains them elements and it's not too hot or too cold, then there's a good chance there could be life on it. So I think, yes, there's a great possibility there's life on other planets. I mean, I think in Contact, she said it'd be a waste of space if it was just us. Remember the end of the movie? So, yes, I think there's a good possibility. But is there any evidence for them if aliens ever come to Earth? I really don't think there is. Yes, sir?
Well, I understand that aliens come from all over the universe, come down here for the anal probing.
Yeah. That could be true. Yes, sir?
Isn't it true that there have been instances where science teachers have refused to teach evolution in classes? How have those teachers been dealt with?
Okay. There has been a few. It's illegal. They can't do it. Science isn't a democracy. Science doesn't, it's completely neutral. I don't go in and when I teach or lecture on science, and I teach at USF, I'm on the adjunct faculty there, I don't go into a biology class and say, okay, I'm an atheist and none of you, this is going to prove that atheism is right. And neither can a teacher say, I'm a Christian or whatever I am, and I'm going to teach you about that as well. They can't do it. It's completely illegal. Do they do it? Yes. We had an issue with Florida virtual schools, the online schooling, that had a lot of issues where they would skip. I mean, they would give the student online the work to do, and the student would say, well, I'm a whatever, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to talk about evolution. It's against my beliefs. They'd say, okay, no problem. They'd grade them. And this is one of the main reasons why I've been against virtual schools, because there's no way to monitor. It's hard enough to monitor, education in the regular school systems. It's almost impossible to monitor it in virtual school. And I don't know whether any of you read the newspaper recently. They just laid off 700 part-time virtual teachers and 400 full-time virtual teachers in Florida because it's not working. I mean, it's really easy to get 50 kids, stick them in a classroom and say, turn your computers on, close the door and good luck. That's a horrible way. How do we expect our kids to learn by doing that? I mean, you know what I do when I was a kid? I put my feet up and, go to sleep or something. I mean, most of us, we don't have that, don't have that predisposition to learn. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question back here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, my name's Peggy. Hi.
Hey, Peggy.
I like your whole thing, and I'll probably join. I think I'm already a Facebook friend of the organization.
Okay.
One of my questions is about Russia. They've been doing pretty well in scientific ways, but there's a rise of the Russian Orthodox Church, and I'm wondering if things are kind of going to go backwards as long as they're allowed to do that. And
isn't it amazing when religion comes in one window, then science tends to go out the other? Yes, it's certainly happening in Russia. And we won't even talk about the gay situation in Russia. They don't want our gay athletes to compete there. I mean, and do you think that's the government, or do you think that's an influence by religion about the gay athletes and stuff? Well, science, I think the more religious you get, the more you tend to have the aspect of we don't need to know anything. I mean, science is a self-correcting system. I mean, we learned something about science today, and one of the arguments I usually have against science, well, you believe this today, science says this today, but in 10 years' time, you could be completely wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's some fundamentals in science that are never going to change. I think gravity, if you think gravity is going to change, you go up on top of a building and jump off and see if you can risk it. I think there's more evidence for evolution than there is for gravity, absolutely. So I don't think, how evolution happened, the perspective of evolution. And I mean, gravity was thought to be a constant. Now they're saying it can be bent around light, and we have things like the Large Hadron Collider that supports this. But I think certain fundamental things in science are never going to change. But science is a self-correcting system, and I think as we go on, things will change. But that doesn't make it bad. I mean, which is worse, to change as you get more knowledge, or say, this is what's true, it's always been true, and irregardless of any evidence, it always will be true. And it's fixed in stone. I mean, that to me is a very narrow viewpoint of taking. And I think, unfortunately, religion takes that tract. I mean, everything's true, it always has been true, always will be true. Have you ever said to a believer, name me one thing that if I could prove to you was not true, would you believe it? Or would you discard your religion? No. But if you were to show me enough evidence to believe there was some sort of supreme being, I would be first to step up there and change my mind. I have that open-mindedness. But unfortunately, religious people don't have that open-mindedness when it comes to questioning their beliefs. And part of what science does is threatens them. It threatens their belief. And I know this sounds bad, but I mean, and I know religion can be very comforting, but as a scientist, I believe in the truth. And no matter how comforting something is, it doesn't make it true. Yes, sir?
You mentioned the English religion courses where they covered all different religions, and you thought that might be a good idea here. I would be concerned to have those courses would be taken over by the religious fanatics that we have here. In other words, a course in religion would end up being a course in Christianity and what to believe.
That could be true. I mean, that's a valid point. But we have to start somewhere, and I think that there is a separation in church and state in this country, but though it's not adhered to very much. I think that what works in one country, you're perfectly correct, may not work in another. You can maybe teach religion in a social class or a philosophy class. I mean, I don't have any objections to that. But whether done at high school level or K to K-12 level is a good idea, then you probably got a good point, because I'm sure people will try to take that class over and propagate their own ideas. So again, but then that happens in the science classroom anyway. So you have to monitor that, and hopefully we've got enough honest people in the school system to do that. Yes, sir.
Do you work with, Steve Schaefer's?
Steve who?
Steve Schaefer's.
I'm not familiar.
He and I was helping him in Texas, opposing the school boards putting creationism and so on in school.
Oh yeah, he's a part of the Texas Freedom Network.
Yes.
Yes. I know who he is. Yes, I'm sorry. Oh, great.
But he worked mostly on the state level, and I worked on the local level.
Right.
And I was able to actually turn one school district totally around just by writing one letter to the editor exposing the candidates who were running to the organizations that were supporting them, and the organizations that were belonged to. And I actually tell people to go to their sites of these organizations to see what they really stood for. And we turned that election around totally, and it worked really well. And I took that same information, I took it to the state Democratic Convention and gave it to all the candidates that I supported, and they all won. So it did work.
I mean, you can be, active in your community to do this.
Ridicule. You really can't ridicule these really fundamentalist organizations. We got a mayor in St. Petersburg who's a creationist. We have a state senator, Rubio, who thinks that creationism ought to be taught on an equal basis with science. And the only way we're going to defeat those is to ridicule their backers.
Absolutely, and
expose them.
I try to do that in a sort of nuanced way. But ridicule is a good thing. But you can't be too overtly that way. But yeah, you're right. But this is the reason again why I'm pushing for a set of national standards, because once them standards are formed, there's no way they can be attacked or changed. I mean, the standards will be adopted a little bit for the state of Florida. I mean, in certain earth sciences, you're obviously going to have to bring in the environment in Florida, the Everglades and, our citrus industry and our phosphate industry. But the basic elements of the next generation of science standards contain exceptionally good science. But once you adopt them, the game's over. They have to be taught.
It scared me if you paid any attention to the Republican debates for the presidency. All the candidates were creationists.
Of course. But you see, this is the vicious cycle we have, ladies and gentlemen. You see, we have a poor standard of education for adults. And those poor, you go on YouTube and ask questions. There's some funny things, how misinformed are American people about science. And see some of the questions they're asked and some of the answers you see. I mean, it's really quite astounding how bad they are. I mean, 50% of the population that were asked didn't know how many days it took for the Earth to go around the sun. 50%. Didn't know it was 365 days. I mean, that is sad. But if we don't get our children now and get them, enamored with a great science education, that's going to move on to, they're going to become parents. They're going to become uninformed parents, and uninformed parents raise uninformed children. And no matter what you do in school or try to do on that level, if your parents are uninformed, then you're going to be uninformed yourself. You're going to end up at Liberty University instead of USF. Yes, sir.
Yes, it seems to me that this whole question has very broad implications for the future of our society and for the future of the world and the future of our species, in fact, because the world we are facing is one which is undergoing dramatic change in terms of climate change, global warming, things that the right doesn't wish to recognize. And we are looking at, even now, we've had continuous increases in the overall global temperature. We've had the Arctic ice caps melting every year. The glaciers are getting smaller and smaller, so on and so forth. Species are migrating from one part of the Earth to a more northerly clime as the temperatures rise. We are seeing all kinds of symptoms: the acidification of the ocean, the diminishment of species. It goes. The list just goes on and on. And I'm very much concerned with this matter as a member of the Tampa Bay Post-Carbon Council. And it seems to me that unless we have adequately educated citizenry, we're not going to be able to do anything to solve these problems which daily grow more urgent. And as I say, it threatens the continuity of our species itself.
Well, yes, I agree with that. I mean, wasn't it one of the state senators that said we really shouldn't worry about global warming for two reasons? One, that Jesus will be coming soon. And number two, God promised after the flood that he wouldn't destroy the earth again. I mean, these are state senators making them statements.
I feel much better now.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is the, the level. Now, it makes you wonder where they were educated and how they would come up with some sort of. But I mean, this is the mindset of of the conservative Christian, radical Christian that are governing our country. I mean, it really is. It's a hard pill to swallow. Yes, sir.
Oh, I just wanted to recommend a book for anyone who wants to pursue this subject further. It was actually published in 1850, and it is appropriately entitled The History of the Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom by Andrew Dixon White. He was the co-founder and first president of Cornell University, and it annotates in exquisite detail the dozens upon dozens of ways that religion has held back the human race in every way, in ways you wouldn't even think about, like lending money, for instance. It's 1,100 and some odd pages in 2 volumes. It ought to be required reading before you get out of grade school.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, all we can do as individuals is, stay in touch, make sure the education system working. I think the bottom line is to all this is, and like I said before, we do have members of our organization at the Florida Citizens for Science who are religious. They're not fundamental Christians or Baptists or something, but they are religious, and they manage to fight for good science education, but also, have some sort of idea that, religion belongs at home or in the church and shouldn't infringe on our lives and on in our school classroom. I think if we can get the kids and get them educated and have a lot more educated and informed group of people in their adulthood, this ain't going to be a short-term job. This is a long-term project. I've been working on it for 15 years now, and it's not easy. But hopefully better informed children can be better informed adults, and hopefully they'll see the vacuousness of their politicians when they stand up and say, "I'm vote for me, I'm going to take care of things, or I'm going to change the budget. By the way, the Earth's only 6,000 years old." To me, or I believe that a huckster in New York found a set of tablets that became a book and, spawned a religion that has several million extremely rich members. Would I vote for a guy that believed all that? Mitt Romney, that's what he believes in. What would you want him running your country knowing about, and he believes in magical underwear, that you can put underwear on that keeps evil spirits. And I can't help thinking in my mind, would I vote for somebody with that mindset? Could you trust your livelihood and the way this country is being run by someone with that set of convictions? Personally, I couldn't. Maybe somebody can overcome that, but I couldn't.
Okay, last.
Yes, sir.
Regarding the book by Andrew White, that can be, I've got it on CD from Bank of Wisdom.
Oh.
Right, it's available.
It's available everywhere, and I think it's probably available online now.
Oh, yeah,
isn't
it is, absolutely.
That-
I have it as a...
I think the secular web has it.
I have it as an e-book, if anybody wants it as a...
Okay, it's an e-book. So you don't even have to pay for it.
Okay.
Let Stephen
One
ask
last
a
question.
and-
Yes, because I'm about to mount.
Yes, I'm sure you are.
Push the button.
I have one final question.
Okay.
And that is, Doctor, you are at the cutting edge of science and religion, geopolitically, globally. And if you follow the money, where does the money lead? Does it lead to the POPE in the Vatican? Where does if you follow the money trail of the battle between religion and science fought now globally, follow the money, where does it lead?
I really can't say in other areas of the world, but I can tell you right now, and the name of the organisation escapes me, and I'll keep talking, and it might come to me, that there's a huge organisation in this country by a philanthropist who left a lot of money. Templeton Institute, thank you, the Templeton Institute, who left a huge amount of money. And basically, their sole aim is to do two things: to make science and religion compatible, and to not so much put creationists in the school classroom, but to they buy people. I think that there are some scientists, reputable scientists, that can be bought. I know, I'm not going to name any names, but I know a recent recipient of the Templeton Institute that I actually spoke with a few months ago, got $1.5 million. That's an awful lot of money. I don't know how much your conscience is worth. I don't think mine is worth. You could buy my conscience about stuff, but this particular scientist has criticized me in writing for criticizing religion, saying, I'm a fundamental scientist. I shouldn't, come on, Chucks, can't we all get along? And I remind him about what happened, a few hundred years ago when scientists got burned at the stake for not accepting or not, trying to propagate scientific, concepts that were not accepted by the church. I'm sure as heck not going to give religion a break when it comes to science, no matter how much you pay me. Again, I have nothing personal about religion. I mean, if it's fine, but I'm not going to let it affect its influence on science, no matter how much money you pay me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, nice enlightening talk. We usually go someplace for dinner afterwards. Anybody who wants to go? Any suggestions for where we should go?
CDBs or up on,
Wagon
West
wheel?
Shore, maybe?
Well,
Hooters?
CDBs?
no, we're not going to Hooters. CDBs? Anybody?
On West Shore?
On West Shore. Okay.
Straight up on,
Straight up, okay.
We'll be on the left.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming. We're going to have a set up of our production committee, but